Hi everyone, thank you for being here with us today. My name is Carmen Jimenez from One Young World. Just a quick reminder that at the end of the session there will be a Q&A part where the both on-site audience here at the ferry and digital audience will be able to ask your questions. For the digital audience, you'll have a code on screen in a second. That code, please, that you will be able to submit on slido.com, and you can submit your questions through there and we will read them out loud here for you. With no further ado, it is my pleasure to present the next session, Building Greener Cities. So please welcome on stage Mette Coban, Phil Glanville, Kevin Patel, Tomaya Gregory, and Esther O'Callaghan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this fantastic session today. And thank you to everyone who's also watching us online to have this fantastic conversation about how we can build greener cities as we're during COP26. Before we start, I just want to say a massive thank you to One Young World and the Extreme Hangout space for allowing this space for young people to have their voices, particularly on a wide range of issues. This event is hosted together with both My Life, My Say, which has created a whole day of events today, together with One Young World, around amplifying youth voices. And it's an organization that's aimed to amplify young people's voices and encourage them to participate in democracy. But also with Hackney Council, an organization that both myself and the Mayor of Hackney represent, which is one of the most ranked as the third greenest borough in the UK right now. I'm doing a lot of plugs for Hackney. But, you know, we're very passionate about making sure that the conversations doesn't just happen in the London Borough of Hackney, and we're able to take their voices over here. And we thought it was really important to have this conversation in partnership with both My Life, My Say and with One Young World. So my name is Mette. I've got a few different hats on. I'm a cabinet member in Hackney responsible for climate change, for energy, waste, transport and public realm. I'm also the CEO and the founder of My Life, My Say. I'm joined by a fantastic panel, which we've got to hear a lot from, and you know, I'm sure they're going to be able to contribute in lots of different ways. But to my left, we've got Kevin Patel, who is the Executive Director of One Up Action International. He joins us from LA, so he's come all the way from LA to COP, and he's been I've been following his journey. We were together in Rome for G20, and then he came here for COP, and he's been extremely instrumental in activating and mobilizing lots of young people around the protests that we've seen, that real energy that we needed to get for climate change. So we're very grateful to have you with us, Kevin. We've got Tomaya Gregory, who's a climate justice activist who joins us today as well. And I'm sure she's going to be able to talk to us a lot around how we could engage, particularly with young people from underrepresented backgrounds who often feel, disconnected from the traditional forms of politics. And I know that you do a lot of work on social media, particularly around sort of how you can make the language much more accessible to that. So we're looking forward to hearing from you as well. And then we've got Esther O'Callaghan, who is the co-director and the leading director of Hundo, which is just announced, actually, they've got £2 million investment? $2 million investment, or nearly there, into creating more jobs for young people. And I think in the conversation about talking about green jobs, I think it's really extremely important that we have someone like Esther who could talk to that, because, we hear a lot about green jobs in COP, but what does that actually mean, for the normal person, and how do you sort of quantify that, and how do you make sure that also it's accessible for young people? So we're very pleased to have you with us today. And at the end, we've got my mayor. I left him to the end because he's my boss. He's the mayor of Hackney. I don't just say this because, he's here with me today, but there is very little people in local government or in politics generally who both has the passion and the desire to make a change around climate change, but also the ideas around how to go about doing it. And you're going to hear lots around what Hackney is doing to tackle the climate crisis. And not only he does a lot around his role as the mayor of Hackney, but he's also the chair of the Transport and Environmental Committee for London Councils, which leads on climate change for all councils in London and is a voice for Londoners. And obviously they're over here present in COP as well. But he also co-leads the Green New Deal recovery plan for the Mayor of London as well. So thank you very much for joining us, Phil. Great. So to kick us off, we obviously here at COP, a day from the penultimate day or before we finish. I want to start with a very quick question, and just to be very brief. Kevin, I'll start with you because you've been involved in a lot of activism. Are you hopeful so far with everything that's happening?
It's really easy to be pessimistic about what's going on in COP. So I will say I'm hopeful. The reason why I'm going to say I'm hopeful is because I see the young people. I see my generation being so activated and so passionate. What I mean, not passionate, but passionate in the sense of survival. Because they understand that this fight, the fight for climate action, is a fight for survival. We understand that our lives are at stake, the lives of animals and plant species, the ecosystems, the biodiversity all around the world is at stake. So I've been, I've been here for 2 weeks, walking around at COP, seeing how young people are just not being into the negotiation rooms, how young people have been let down, how young people have really experienced some bad traumatic events at COP. But I have also seen the other side of tens and thousands of people marching and speaking out about the injustices that are happening at COP and around the world. So I am hopeful for this generation, I'm hopeful for my generation, and I'm hopeful that if they don't act, we will. Because guess what? Once COP is over and if they failed us, they're going to be, we're going to be wrecking and, I'm losing my words, but we are going to be knocking down the barriers to, get our action.
Thank you, Kevin. And Tomeo, just to build on that, I mean, you do a lot of work with, particularly around trying to make this conversation much more accessible to younger people and making sure that their voices are involved. Are you hopeful for young people that we're going to get something out of COP that's going to be meaningful for our cities and regions around the country?
I mean, I feel like I would have just given a very similar answer to Kevin in that I don't know if I find that from COP itself, but from what is outside of COP and all the people working together and mobilizing outside of it. I think especially it's been nice to meet people who are from all over, but also to be in somewhere like Scotland where there are local issues to focus on as well as the global. For example, like the Stop Cambo campaign, which is something that I'm part of, which is fighting to stop the Cambo oil field in the North Sea. Just being around the people who are organising around that has been really inspiring, and that gives me hope. Just being in the same space as them, I think, is really important and is, if not just as valuable as what goes on behind the not very accessible gates of the blue zone.
Yeah. And Phil, slightly to sort of flip the question a little bit. So I think we've heard a lot about the hopefulness that's coming out of COP. I think there's a real danger that we will sort of see COP as the only sort of moment, and I know we speak about this a lot as well, but I guess coming back to the theme of build greener cities, what does that mean for the community that you represent in Hackney, and what does that look like, and what would you like to see?
Thanks, Mate. I think I thought you were going to ask me this sort of question about am I hopeful, and I would echo what sort of has already been said, and because Cities and Regions Day is the penultimate day of COP, and you could think we were the last minute afterthought, but actually we're getting to define how the end of this conference is framed, and I think that's really important. And ultimately, whether you're a campaigner activist, whether you're a city leader like myself, you're going back into your communities and campaigns to deliver on the ground, and you're going to do that much quicker and faster. And I think that's what we do in Hackney, in terms of the Rebuilding a Greener Hackney work that we do together. But it's a phrase that was used this morning by Core Cities, which is a group of cities in the UK, that the nation's pledge and cities deliver. I feel that even more acutely today than when I first read that message this morning. There's serious conversations about how we unpack what we need to do to not just get to net zero, but how we get to net zero. Because that's the other element, I think, about what we're doing in Hackney is a sort of people's community-centred approach. It's not thinking about technological solutions. It's not thinking about solutions that are business as usual but greener, but actually really tackling the sort of big issues. And I'll sort of finish on the point, a point that I think pulls all those themes together. There will be people at this conference that can tell you can get to net zero by switching all of the world's vehicles to EV vehicles, and that does the job, and it's brilliant. and we'll all go green. There's a lot of sponsorship in that direction. The extractive impact of that on the global south will be catastrophic. The waste of the embedded carbon in the existing vehicles we have won't be recycled and will be lost. And that opportunity to reimagine what our cities are for and the social barriers to accessing vehicles and public transport that we already have in our societies. You know, we all have parts of our cities that are inaccessible due to public transport, people that don't have access to EV vehicle infrastructure. So from my perspective, always approach it with a sort of social justice, societal aspect and combine that with net zero and the nature recovery as well. You know, it's not just about saving carbon, it is actually nature recovery, the return of biodiversity, what our cities are for. I think if we can crack all of that, then there's massive reasons to be hopeful, and that's the type of work that we do. And there's so many more opportunities to collaborate with activists and citizens if you follow that path than if you just try and transition a society that we have already and an economy that we have already. And I hope that while we will always be people that local organisations will sometimes campaign against, we've got more in common with those with the hunger for change than some of the national governments and the decisions they're making with business. That doesn't mean business doesn't have a role, but I think we have to constantly challenge it to say that it's not going to be good enough just to do business as normal in a greener way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There's so much that I want to unpack into that, and obviously from what Kevin and Tomei has already said as well. But Esther, just to throw the question to you, I want to take us away from the hopeful and what does it mean for your community. But Phil spoke about, he started to get into a bit more of the detail about what building greener cities look like, and I want us to sort of imagine that by the end of the session. I mean, you do a lot of work around career opportunities for lots of young people, and that's what you've taken pride in your career for over the past decade. And we hear a lot about, these green jobs. Do you see that resonating with young people? So is there like an excitement or a sense of excitement from young people to say, hey, like there's this new wave of jobs that are going to come. How do I access it? What does that look like? Is that conversation starting to happen in that field, or do you think we're not there yet?
So is that on?
Yeah.
Oh, that's all right then. So we've partnered with Green Britain Academy as a career platform. My focus, I grew up in Blackpool, which for those of you who don't know where it is, it's a very rundown seaside town in the north. And I left school when I was 16 because I had to. Perfectly bright, but it wasn't an option to go to school, to go to university. It's kind of not changed very much since I was a kid, and I think for me, there's two bits of it. It's really exciting actually in many ways that we are, if you want to call it, fourth industrial revolution in terms of a green revolution. But actually, if you look at the sector, it is predominantly white. It is predominantly privileged. Not a criticism, it's just how it is. And actually the ability to bring young people from diverse backgrounds to help them to, they don't need help, to empower them to understand that this is a sector that they can get into. Because I think that with the best will in the world, look, my son is 17. It's his generation that's going to be left with the mess that the adults have made. And actually, if it's going to be about adaptation, then I think it's our duty as the generations before to actually make sure that they actually don't just have to stand in the street and protest, because I feel like that's the only thing they can do, that they can actually work in the sector, they can start to shape the adaptive future that is what they are going to have to face. So that's why we do what we do.
No, thank you for that. And I think, one of the key things that are coming out of this discussion is clearly that, climate change and social justice go hand in hand. And, Tommy, I want to come to you because, we hear a lot about these phrases around sort of climate justice. And I just wonder if you could sort of unpack for that why it's so important that those two things go hand in hand. And we should never forget that, social justice really needs to underpin everything that we do.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, my understanding of that came from where my sustainable journey started, which was I wanted to be a fashion designer. and I always grew up wanting to do that. And then I started to unpick what the fashion industry was doing to both people and the planet. And in uncovering that, I uncovered, the mess of the rest of the world, essentially, and how all of that is linked. And I think the way of framing it is kind of like, it's not just, as Phil said, it's not just about like changing the way we're living to like a greener version. It's also looking at the way we're living in itself. So it's looking at climate as, why are we living lives which are 9-to-5 jobs in polluting industries that is then creating like a mental health crisis and all of this stuff? Like, it's how it all links with other issues that are already there. And how that ties back to what is creating the climate crisis. And it's not just that, it's also racial injustice and gender inequality and all of these things that, if you actually look and unpick it, like, they do tie back to what is essentially destroying our planet and leading us to an unhealthy future. So that's kind of, hopefully, a very basic understanding of it.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that description. And I want to take us more to sort of the specifics of cities. We know that most cities and regions have an issue around air quality and air pollution. It's a big problem. Actually, I think in London now, it causes more death than, I think it's 7% of deaths are now related to some form of health-associated risk from air pollution. And I wonder if, Kevin, you come from LA, and I know they drive lots of cars in LA, having been in LA. What initiatives do you think cities need to take to start to clean up our air? Or is there like anything that you've seen that has worked quite well?
Yeah, I guess Los Angeles is a bad example of that. Not only cars, but factories and the fossil fuel industry right in our backyards leads to air pollution and smog pollution. And then, at the age of 12, I was directly impacted by the air pollution in Los Angeles, getting heart palpitations and irregular heartbeat. And I guess, I think cities, when we're thinking about sustainable, what are we actually sustaining, right? Are we sustaining the current systems as they are, causing the systems of repression? Or are we looking at the way that we build cities, right? And how we, for instance, the fossil fuel industry and how oil wells are near schools, hospitals, are right behind our homes. So we have to really look at that and saying, okay, can we move those away from where kids are growing up, where adults are going to be at, and where people are going to be at, and moving that away from the general population where we can actually do that, because obviously we're not going to be able to get a just transition until we move away from fossil fuels. But I haven't really seen a good way to get rid of or stop the air pollution. I mean, like, during the pandemic, we saw that air pollution really went down, and because the cars were stopped. So I think one of the things I've seen the mayor implement within Los Angeles is more bike lanes and more street closures and stuff like that, so people are more willing to take public transportation. So I think that might be a good way to curb air pollution and smog pollution, but I think in the long run, a lot of people still drive their cars.
Yeah. I wonder if, Phil, if we can bring you in here as a case study, for both from Hackney, but from what you're seeing in London, just to kind of inform sort of the audience. What are some of the measures that we're taking in Hackney or that you've seen in London that are good best practice examples of tackling air pollution?
I'm just going to start with framing it slightly. And I heard yesterday at a Sustainable Transport Fringe event that in the terms of the UK, not only is it a third of air pollution is road transport and a third of carbon emissions are road transport, the air pollution challenge that both you and Kevin have talked about, but we haven't seen any reduction in the carbon impact of road transport since 1990. So actually there's been a growth in vehicle ownership, for all of the efficiencies of the engines, for all of the work on different types of vehicles, electrification of some of the fleet. We haven't made an impact on the carbon impact. There are also 36 million vacant seats on a normal morning commute in the UK, and the average car occupancy in a trip has fallen to 1.2 people, which is the lowest it's ever been, and there's been a huge increase in car ownership. So for where we are, there have been very few restrictions on the private car. And at the same time, we've seen the cost of public transport increase, and actually the quality of the connectivity of that in many parts of the UK outside London decrease. So it's not surprising to find this situation where we are, and why we're having to take quite radical steps to change it. If you take part in the debate on social media, though, you would think that we're an anti-car society, and that cars were sort of really put upon. And I think what we're just doing is resetting the balance. So in London, we've got a mayor of London who's just expanded the ultra-low emission zone, which is one of the largest and toughest emission-based zones that operate 24/7 anywhere in the world. I think that's incredibly important. What we're doing in Hackney is, I think it's very easy to sort of pick parts of the puzzle and say, I like that bit, I'm not quite so sure about that bit. But actually, if you really want to change the nature of how a city can still grow but restrict the car, you've got to have controlled parking zones, you've got to have car-free developments, you've got to have school streets, you've got to have bike lanes, you've got to have the EV infrastructure for what remains, and then you do have to use LTNs and filtering to change how the city moves around, and then invest in public transportation. There are bits of it that people really like school streets that are quite easy, they surround schools, they're quite fluffy. But if you don't put a school street in a place where there are other restrictions on the private car, you are not going to let your 7-year-old scoot or cycle to school by themselves or with their friends, or allow maybe a secondary school student to cycle all the way, because it will be that little bit around the school that you've changed. But actually everything beyond that is still car dominated. So it is all of this together that will have an impact on the carbon emissions for road transport, air pollution, but also encourage a healthier, more community-based lifestyle. This is all happening at once, and change is very painful, and we have to also think about the inequalities impacts for people that still do rely on the car, very large families, disabled people, and that's why we're investing in EV infrastructure, because we do want to make sure that what is still there, whether it's car clubs, local businesses, have the infrastructure they need to make the transition. But we do have to change our relationship with the private motor car, otherwise we're just not going to be successful on any of these fronts.
Yeah, and I guess just to sort of throw in a little plug there for Hackney on the school streets in particular, I think what we've seen in terms of its success is since we've rolled out 48 school streets, which is the highest in the country, we've seen a 74% reduction of tailpipe emissions outside our school gates, a 30% increase in more children walking to school, and then a 51% increase in children either cycling or scooting to school, which is fantastic, and it sort of fits into some of that long-term behavioural change around how do we move around as a society. So I think we're definitely seeing sort of the benefits of it. I want to come back to sort of this conversation around sort of young people and the role that they can play to sort of shape society. And Nesta, I wonder if I can come to you. I think, you've done a lot of work sort of particularly in sort of, I know you do a lot of work around employment, but, a lot of your work is also around youth voice and giving young people the space to sort of have their voice on a range of different topic issues. What do we need to do to really, Kevin, me and Kevin was talking a lot about this in G20, where we was on a panel talking about, young people wanting to be at the table. So there's that, which is wanting to have a say. But then what do we need to actually give them power-wise to actually make meaningful change? How do you make it empowering?
So I was on a policy innovation podcast, and I was asked what one policy innovation would I make, and I said I would set up a global Gen Z party, because the truth is, when I was like 23, I was the youngest person to be on the big lottery fund, so there's overseeing, public money. And they always used to laugh because I brought the average age of the board down by about, 30 years. and they were lovely people. But it is daunting, and it's kind of, you walk into that room and they are sort of, it can be really, really daunting. And I think the systems that we have exist, and I just want to find ways of young people being able to understand how you might not like the system, you might not accept it, but sometimes you have to break it down from the inside. I think you need to do both. And so actually that kind of education, political education, financial education, all of those things, so that you can understand the system that you're in and then work to disrupt it more effectively.
Yeah, and just to come to Talmir and to Kevin, to both of you, have you seen any good case examples of where young people have been involved in sort of decision making at a local level, which has led to sort of much more positive impact in terms of our environment? Or have you not? And if not, then what would you like to see sort of decision makers do?
Yeah, I guess a case study would be Los Angeles County, where I was able to implement a youth climate commission, being the first ever in the world and first ever in the nation in the United States. Never to be done before, giving young people a voice, not only a voice, but at their seat at the table, but not only at the table, but they're able to bring the solutions and the ideas, as well as the actions that they want their local politicians to take within their communities. And so I think this model of a youth climate commission can be implemented all around the world. It was brought up to C40, which C40 started their own youth climate council that was modeled, that was taken by the Youth Climate Commission, which I architect. It gives not only young people the voice, but it gives the people the power, the young people the power to really act on climate and demand for action. So that's one case study I've seen how young people can really take their power back, but I would love to hear from you.
I mean, I wish I had an example and a case study to give. I think it's a really important point because it's something that I'm really aware of. You know, we have the term greenwashing, which is where people try to make themselves seem more eco-friendly. But now there's like youth washing, where people try and use young people to seem like they're actually like listening to us as young people to enact change. And it's just like, we feel like we end up being used as like this symbol of hope rather than actually people listening to us and taking it on board what we have to say and what we want to see happen. Like one example I saw recently was there was like a business-focused COP event in my local county, and I hadn't heard of it, even though I'm like in the climate space and have connections within climate in my local community. And I think the only youth there that they had kind of brought in were like schools. And like that's great, but also that excludes people who aren't in school, the age bracket, whether you're home educated, whatever. But also like, where are the youth activists in the local area speaking? Where are the people who can kind of push the limits of what is probably going to be said at that sort of event? And so I think that's an example. Like, if you want, if you're going to have events and talk about how important the youth are and how much they inspire you, like, have them there. And like actually let them say what needs to be said. Yeah, don't use us as a symbol of hope.
I guess just to sort of pick up on that, how important is it to obviously have, and Phil, I might come to you on this, like, because you're a young mayor, you got elected as the mayor of Hackney at the age of 36, I believe, and you're obviously a councillor in your 20s as well. I mean, we're talking about, there's one bit which is about how do you kind of create those decision-making bodies for young people to be represented, but also how important is it that we actually have young people leading actually as decision makers, and what have you seen from your experiences that has worked really well?
So I think before we came to COP, we convened quite a lot of discussions amongst young people in Hackney. I think that was really important to listen to school councils, the youth parliament. We had launched over the last 3 years a Hackney Young Futures Commission with an 80-point plan, not just on climate, but how to improve all council services. And one of the things we've tried to do is not confine young people to a debate about issues that are just on like a sort of young people's train track. So what young people wanted to talk about was how is planning shaped? How is democratic decisions made there when we're not in the room? And I think sometimes institutions, schools, set up their sort of democratic structures around young people as young people's issues and only keep them on that narrow track. So I'm not saying we're perfect, but I think we've done quite a lot of work to try and broaden that out. I think we try and involve young people in the debate around transport. So the work with School Streets doesn't stop or end there. The eco schools work, financial literacy. I think now we're starting to think about where does that sort of activism at school lead into skills, financial literacy, and potentially green jobs? Because if you're starting to excite a generation about being part of the solution, and then there's no way that you can sort of see, especially if you're from a diverse background, into jobs, I think it's really important we crack that. The final thing I'm going to say, be a bit controversial. Meta invites me to panels where I'm usually now the oldest member of the panel, and I've probably taken the average age up. I think there's something to really reflect on about youth activism. In reality, in our Western societies, the people that are probably having the least carbon impact are probably generation 70 plus, especially if they're from poorer backgrounds. And I do think there's some intergenerational work to be done here. I'm going to bring my mum in. My mum's never owned a car. She's never flown on a plane. She religiously recycles. She turns the lights off. She drinks water. You know, that things that we were taught as young people that we reacted against because there seemed to be unlimited consumerism and unlimited possibility. There are people in our societies probably all over the world that have been saying from the very start that you're being wasteful, you could wear those shoes again, you don't have to have the latest thing. And I think there's something about linking the generations together on this and embedding that in communities. Because when we do food growing projects in Hackney, the people that are usually most passionate about them are women. And they're people that want to pass the skills down to the next generation and get young people interested in nature and biodiversity. And that can deliver massive improvements to an estate, to public housing, to our parks, and have that wonderful intergenerational opportunity to bring people together in our communities.
No, and that's a very important point that I think we should probably discuss, which is around the growing intergenerational divide that we have starting to see within the UK, in the context of the UK and probably sort of in most parts of the world. You know, we saw that with, you know, I'm not going to open up a conversation about Brexit, but obviously intergenerational divide was one of the big things there, and also the urban-rural divide as well. So I wonder, maybe I could start with Esther and sort of work this way, sort of down the panel. How do we bring both those generations together, and you know, like in what spaces can we bring sort of like both young and old people together?
So some of the obviously intergenerational poverty is systemic and structural, as is privilege. And I think actually totally agree with you. It is. There's so much, I don't know about anyone else, but like my grandma was like the most awesome person ever. And exactly that, you know, they recycled that's just what you did. I think that, I actually think there's a huge amount of waste that happens on both sides. So you have older people who have all of this life experience, and then when they retire, retirement is effectively redundancy. So you lose all of that skill, all of that knowledge, and then you have young people who are growing up with, obviously you can speak only from my, you know, no careers advice really, you know, no trajectory as to where you can go. And actually, grandparents or that generation make brilliant mentors. They've been there, you know, I used to work in care homes, you know, so they're just like, and they've had whole lives, you know, they're amazing. And I think actually some of the work we're looking at is how to, with kind of mentoring and support of an older generation, to kind of support them coming through. I think it's really important, yeah, hugely important.
Definitely. And Kevin, if I come to you, how do you feel as a sort of young sort of climate activist, like what message do you want to get out there to not just to decision makers, but to people from across different generations around the type of future that you want to have?
Yeah, I guess understanding the different realities that we all live in, right? We heard about connecting the dots earlier about intersectionality, and something that we need is intersectionality in our solutions, in our conversations, as well as intergenerationalship. So this is a really intergenerational panel.
He done this in Rome to me, where in Rome we were
I'm not looking.
We were sitting on a panel and I was moderating.
Look, I'm not
every
directly
time he
looking.
said old, he looked at me, and I was like, I don't know who you're looking at or why you're looking at me, but I'm not old. Yeah.
I wasn't looking at you this time, so I was like, let me look down the floor. But no, this panel is quite, you know, we're talking about intergenerationalship, and I think we all come from different generations, right? So I think one of the things that I would tell, you know, I think young people and people in general, older generations, is that we have to really look at the different realities that we all come from. Young people are thinking not only about their generation, but they're thinking about the next 7 generations that will come after them. And we're thinking about the dire need to take action because we're already in the 6th mass extinction. We're losing plants and animals, right? And I don't want to get pessimistic on everyone here, but you know, if there was any time to act, it would be now. And so I think the leaders in COP and the government officials quite don't understand that. And I heard a speech by Elizabeth. I'm blanking on the last name. Do apologize. It's been a long day. But she said, open up your hearts and act. I think the reason why we all need to come from empathy. All of us need to work with one another to really understand the depth that young people are coming from the reason why we fight for climate justice, the reason why we're fighting for justice, because I think we can sit on panels and talk about this over and over and over again, but I think we're already living the shared realities of that. We're already facing this crisis, and if we don't act, the next 7 generations won't get to see a polar bear. The next 7 generations might not even be able to see a forest because of the rampant deforestation. So I think that's where I come from, of like really understanding the different realities, understanding how we must connect the dots with intersectionality, and understanding that we must be intergenerational. We have to work with one another to really get action.
This time he looked at me when he said young, so I forgive you for no, I completely agree with you, Kevin. I think you've made some very, very good points. Tomei, I wanted to come to you because we've got 25 minutes left, and before we go to sort of questions from members of the audience and from people who are watching us online, we talk a lot about climate change at a very national, international level, and obviously this is an international United Nations conference. But the reality is, we can all sit around and wait for people in the blue zone to, come up with the answers and to sort of to do something that's going to improve our climate and obviously our livelihoods. What is it that you would like to see at a local level that mayors like Phil or cabinet members like me or other people in this room who can go away and actually start taking action locally, obviously being realistic about the resources that we do have, but what is it that you would like to see local mayors and local decision makers do?
I think one way I like looking at the climate crisis, I've forgotten the name of the writer who said this, so forgive me for that, but it's that the climate crisis is also a crisis of the imagination, and the way that we see our solutions, like, as much as it's, yes, there are resources that and limited funds and stuff like that, but like, if we really deeply care and we view it as a crisis that, is for future generations aren't going to be able to see a forest or experience nature in the way that we might have had, then surely we should be doing absolutely everything. Like, surely we should be being as radical as possible, pushing as far as possible, even if it's gonna, it might annoy a few folks, or maybe at times might get us in a little bit of trouble. Like, if it's gonna do, if we're going to do it absolutely as much as we possibly can, then that's what we've got to do. Like, you've got to imagine and think outside the box and think further than the systems that we're living in. Like, I think one example that really grinds my gears, and I've just realized that's an unintentional pun for what I'm about to say, is the fact that, like, the roads and the bike lanes in, like, my local area, like, that all goes through the county council, and that just, like, it makes no sense to me because it's for my town and, like, my town's bike lanes. Like, why does my council not have why is that not their job? And I'm not someone who understands how all the systems work, but I can see that that's a system problem, and that is a lack of imagination that we haven't gone, actually, what if we just, change that? Like, maybe we could make bike lanes a bit easier if the people who actually live there had the chance to do it, not people a bit further out and who hold all the money and whatnot. So yeah, that's my way of looking at it. It's like, actually, if we're not heading in the right direction, like, why are we not doing absolutely everything? Like, it seems really simple to me.
I just wanted to add on top of that, because you bring a very good point of why not give communities the agency to act on behalf of their own neighborhoods, their own place that they grew up in. Like, who better to act on the climate crisis than the communities that live there? Because we have a sense of, if we had a sense of urgency, the marginalized communities, the people who are at the forefront of this crisis, don't really have the power to act on behalf of their own community, and I find that quite disturbing. I always say this, the communities that are being affected by the climate crisis can solve the climate crisis because they're bringing the solutions. We just need to hear them, we need to fund them, we need to give them the agency and the power to do so. And I just wanted to add on top of what you already said.
I agree. Yeah. Like, if you're experiencing the issue, like, on your doorstep, you're going to know what needs fixing.
Yeah.
So, like, give them the space to do that.
Very good contributions. Phil, I'm going to come to you just before I go to the questions. I think it's really important for us to hear from a leader in local government around what types of powers, or what is it that you need as a leader in local government to be able to be serious about taking action at a local level? Because I think often, there is, partly because we're not educated about how democracy works in this country, I think there is a conflation between what decision makers at a local level can do. So I think it would be really good for the audience to know, one is, what are the powers that you currently have and what are you doing? And then what is it that you can't do because you need more support? That's why you're in COP, to ask for it from government.
Thanks. I'm looking at the clock counting down. I'm assuming questions start in about a minute.
This is
so
my,
explaining a UK government in like a minute, I think might be impossible. But why I'm here at COP predominantly is on behalf of Hackney Councils, London Councils, with core cities to ask for a better funding and regulatory environment to allow us to get to net zero. Now, I could talk for 20 minutes about that, but fundamentally, we have very few of the financial levers at our disposal in local government, and regulation doesn't place us front and centre around delivery. And it's slightly improved during the road to COP, so there's a net zero, I think, forum for local government that's being set up by government. But when you look at all the big funding announcements, the heat and building strategy, all of it doesn't really have local government at its heart, and we're here to say it should do. And only at that stage can you move on to Kevin's stage and to Mia's stage of going on to them people. Because if it is all just delivered through central government, through big contractors, through short-term funding streams, that we're all in, the tragedy is bad competition. We have to compete with other places like ourselves to get the crumbs to deliver net zero schools, rather than saying, here is a 10-year funding settlement that would allow you to transition all of your public buildings. And then it's a competition of ambition rather than a competition for the crumbs from the table. So I've taken longer than I should, but for me it is around a long-term plan that has communities and local authorities at whatever level, because it could be that district council, it could be a town, it could be somewhere like Totnes that wants a circular economy. They're not empowered to do that because all the power is hoarded at some greater level. And I think Metro mayors are fantastic things as well, and they're at the negotiating table through the C40, but they hoard power as well. And we need to get the power and the money down to the lowest level to really deliver the systems change that we need. Otherwise, it's just silos all over the place.
Thank you very much, Phil. So we've got 18 minutes and 38 seconds. I want to take some questions from everyone here. Who's got any questions for us? And we've got questions online as well. So do you want to, let's go online first, and then we've got a question at the front as well.
Hello. So we have some great questions coming in from our online audience. One question from George from Liberia. How can we get corporates on board building greener?
Okay. Let's take the second question as well. So let's do it in rounds. So do you want to just go next, and then we'll pass over here as well?
So I'm asking this question because it's about buildings. So in building, you talk about net zero as it's a sort of circular net zero. So you've got the building and then all the renewables, and that's it. Whereas in the blue zone, net zero equals you can plant some forests and do carbon credits. So I'm wondering if we should rethink the name and the terminology to make sure we're not confusing things.
Okay. Thank you. So we've got a question about buildings. And then I think there was one more question here at the front. Yeah.
So I was wondering actually too about the cities. I was thinking, like, is it harder to involve like local people living in the cities as opposed to involving local people living in suburban areas or rural areas? Because in cities, people often live there for a bit less longer, and also, like, there's a more faster turnover from people living there. Like, how do you experience that, and how do you get people to, be involved in those decisions?
Right. So we've got 3 questions. There's 16 minutes and 45 seconds to count. Yesterday, I used the Squid Game analogy for anyone who watches Squid Game. This is I'm still trying to find my team partner because the panelists yesterday failed me. So we're going to get through as many questions as we can. So on the corporate question, I want to give that to you, Esther, if that's okay. What can corporates do to build greener?
So for me, it's I think there's two parts to it. There has to be, I think, stronger regulatory frameworks. It's not good enough just to wait for the private sector to do it voluntarily. Obviously, I can only speak from my own expertise about youth employment. You know, more young people from more diverse backgrounds being given better opportunities, better access to kind of the jobs that are coming up. So I think it needs to be a combination of both.
Phil, if I can come to you about the questions around buildings, because obviously that's a key part of how we reach net zero.
So if you look at Hackney's path to net zero, it does have an element of the final 20% will be offset when we look at our phase 1, 2 and 3 emissions. I think Mette and I are very keen to go beyond that and further than that and not leave that to the last minute, because if you wait to 2040 and then you plant your 100,000 trees, I think we will have failed. But that's how the maths works at the moment. I think the complexity around buildings is getting a full life cycle cost and the energy contribution, the costs of any demolition and rebuilding. We have some pioneering work around cross-laminate timber and seeing buildings as carbon sinks. So seeing the building as a sink for carbon rather than something that is putting carbon into the world either through its operation or its end construction or operation. But these are really complex issues, and I think we need a good carbon accounting standard, and that's something that London Councils is developing with the LGA. So when we take it down to the city level, you can hold us to account on our existing ambition and then push us to go further and not leave it to the types of accounting that is happening in the blue zone, because I think we need to do better than that. And if, it is absurd that the world's airports can trumpet the fact that they're net zero at some point just because they've planted a couple of trees and switched their energy to green electricity, when the things taking off from the runway contribute to a huge amount of emissions. So we have to be really careful on this accounting work. And I don't think anyone's got the right answer yet, but I think we're having the right discussions.
Yeah, you can see why he's the mayor of Hackney, right? Tommy and Kevin, I want to come to you around involving people in decision making and how we do that at a very sort of practical level. I just wonder if you can come back to to that question. Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I guess for young people in general, I think, I used the case study of the Youth Climate Commission. That's only just the first part, right?
But no, let's say take it away from young people. I mean, obviously young people as well, but I think, one of the conversations that have been coming out of COP, and we've been talking about social justice, is when you look at most working class people, right, people who climate change disproportionately impacts, often they're the ones who are excluded from this conversation, not because out of choice, but there's a lot of barriers that exist. One, it's time and privilege to be involved in these conversations because, often you're more concerned about getting food on your table rather than sort of having the opportunity to come like here today to be talking about these issues. They probably just don't have that time. Two, there's an issue around climate literacy as well, which is how do we, make this issue sort of much more accessible to those communities so that they understand, one, their own carbon footprint, but also two, how they're going to benefit from a shift to a much more sustainable life. So how do we involve people who probably have, let's say in the context of the UK and the US, like have, English as a second language, probably like 2-3 jobs. How do we reach out to them?
Climate education. Climate education is the way to go, I think. In the US specifically, and I'm using US because we don't have climate education, right? And I'm sure the UK has the same problem. And I think around the world, a lot of people have been advocating for climate education. Accessibility, when you talked about literacy, I also want to talk about languages and how the language barrier, right? And how a lot of what is talked about in climate is in English. There's a great organization called Climate Cardinals by Sophia Kiani, which translates the climate crisis, as well as like climate information into, 100 languages or so. So I think that makes it more accessible for people who don't understand climate in the English context, but in another language, and so they're able to learn about it. So I think education being one of them, educating the general public and the working class so that they're more up to date on what climate change is and how they're able to act on it, and making it more accessible. So like having it in different languages, and Yeah, I guess that's where I can add it, but I'm going to pass it to Michael.
And Tommy, just to add one further sort of addition to that, or an additional question is, what role do you think that sort of digital engagement can play? So like, we see social media being a powerful tool. How can we use digital means to sort of improve climate literacy?
Big question is one that I really struggle with because, like, as much as I hope I make my content and what I do online quite accessible and just like, I make it how I would want it. So it's like easy, fun, relatable. I'm just honest about where I'm at and stuff like that. Like, I'm still in a climate bubble. Like, as much as I wish I was reaching out to people in an accessible way that's bringing in new people, I'm probably still speaking to people who are already somewhat aware or have been awoken in some way to the climate crisis. So like, I don't know if I have the answer because it's so difficult. And part of that is honestly to do with like social media and algorithms. Like, social media doesn't want me to share my anti-fossil fuel like content to the masses because that's not what, they're being funded by it or whatnot. So like, it's a really tricky one.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject because I wanted to add on to the point of like the inaccessibility, right, for disabled people as well. It's like they don't have ASL or they don't have translators. So like a lot of the information is not getting to the wider public because of climate crisis as well as climate change, and the knowledge is in an echo chamber. It's a certain few people who know about it and want to act on it, but then quite a lot of people, millions of people are left out of the conversation. And so how can we make this information accessible, right? I'm in the Blue Zone, obviously, and I saw, just a few days ago that they barely put up signage for, people who are in wheelchairs to come in and have access. So it's just like those, they're not little things, those big things that are missing from these COP conferences, these summits, and these, the panels as well.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good point. Right, so we've got 9 minutes left, so I'm going to go for one last round of questions. So, Mitch, can we come to you for online to see if there is anyone? And then if anyone else wants to ask a question, please indicate your hand and I'll come to you next. You've got, yeah, that would be helpful, yeah, please, thank you. Yeah, go on, Mitch.
All right, so Gerald from London, I know we've touched on it already, but Gerald from London wants to know, maybe from each of you, what you each think is the most effective way for young people to get involved in greening their communities.
Okay, we've had different versions of that. So we've got the gentleman there, and then we've got another gentleman at the back.
Oh, you're here. Thanks.
Yes, hello, excellent discussion. So I'm from Oxford, which by all accounts is supposed to have a more progressive local council than some other parts of the country. But I wondered how the panel felt about young people taking direct action, because it seems to me, I run a community gardening group in Oxford, and it is so frustrating. Trying to get anything done officially takes forever and a day. And sometimes I feel, why not just get on and do the climate actions? Some of them might be wrong. For example, tree planting. If you want to go through the county council, it costs £500 per tree. Ridiculous. If you go through the city council, they have to do it all through their funding and planning. It's about a dozen trees a year. Obviously, you have to plant the right tree in the right place. But my argument would be direct action. Just go ahead and do it. Plant the trees. And if it's wrong, rather than paying the council to plant the tree in the first place, plant the trees, and then they can pay to remove them if they're wrong. Let's be more progressive about it.
Okay, that's very interesting. Go to the other gentleman there as well, please. The one at the back there, sorry. Thank you.
Hi, how are you all? I have aged out of the youth climate movement, and I still work in climate action, and I sometimes reflect on youth climate activists making mistakes that I've already made, and I, also really benefit from getting to know young people in the U.S. and in Sunrise Movement and other places. And I was wondering if any of you have had really successful examples of mentorship and building those relationships within movement to build memory and reflection on what's gone, and also sort of passing lessons up to people who have already kind of gone before, because that's really valuable too.
Thank you. A very good question. So we're at 6 minutes and 39 seconds. So I think the council question.
Yeah, can I do?
Yeah, can you do that? Yeah.
Can I do? So I don't think this is easy, And I don't think traditionally, because everyone's siloed, everyone's worried about their maintenance budgets, they're worried about doing it right. And I think we're about halfway to the world that you want to see in Hackney. So we have the ambitious council tree planting programme, 5,000 street trees, 4 years, semi-mature as well, so we're not talking... in one part of the borough where we install them, we have a project with Friends of the Earth and local community called 10 Times Greener, where we've stopped spraying glyphosate, and we've handed over the tree pits to the local community, and there's a lot of community planting, and it is a stunning nature recovery project, and it's come from activism. It works with our schools, it works with young people. In another part of the borough, we were tweeted where we maintain our tree pits in a traditional way. Someone had tried to do the same thing, and we ripped it all out. So what you have to do is educate your own services to move on with the times of the kind of work that we want to see. And I think Mette and I have been talking, how do we start giving away power around our tree planting programme next? Because if you want another 5,000 trees, is it just corporately delivered, or is it saying to communities, where would you like those trees now? We've done the basics on tree canopy. We've taken us from 20 to 30%. Getting to 40 should involve community. And that's what I would like to see. And just very quick, I think cities are the best place to do it, and rural areas are the best place to do it, because I think place and identity and sharing the same spaces are there. I think the suburbs are the hardest bit because they're so car-based. You know, people aren't sharing public transport, they're not necessarily sharing the same community centre. And while they may be living there more in a stable way, they see each other less. And I think that's probably why the suburbs are harder to crack. If you're doing practical things like recycling, cities can be really complex because of transitory populations, private renters, refugees, migrants. You know, you have to work that extra mile to include people and deal with some and respond to some of the intersectionality Kevin and others have referenced. But I still think cities are a key building block.
Can I also just quickly jump in and say yes to direct action? Because we're not going to get anywhere if we don't do that. And like, yeah, we can plant trees. Like, guerrilla gardening is a thing we can do. That's a very small part of direct action. Make sure what you're doing is like native and suitable for where you're doing it. But like, yeah, you can take action into your own hands, and we very much need that in every possible opportunity we have.
And then Esther, for the mentorship question, because I guess that kind of...
I actually just wanted to say as well about I was a trustee of a city farm for about 5 years, and the council actually gave over the allotments to the farm, and I think wherever councils can do that, it does work. It's very effective. We were able to build a connection centre that got 50,000 young people with special needs, young people with disabilities. You know, it is possible to do some really good stuff, and we did do some seed bombing. So. On the mentor thing, I actually want to go back to my intergenerational, because I forgot half of what I wanted to say, which is actually I think young people now are more and better informed and educated, I think for the first time in history than the generations before them. So I think that dialogue both ways, peer-to-peer mentoring, but also young people actually mentoring, probably sort of more like, I'd say like middle age, like we were saying about kind of grandparents, bit better, but I think that generation that's actually quite scared of all of this, I think a lot of the resistance to change is often rooted in deep fear, and I think actually being able to get that dialogue working both ways effectively is really, really important. An example that I can give is a friend of mine. We have an environmental management, sustainability management organisation, and he grew up in a solar-powered circus. And went on tour with the Green Roadshow as a child. He's now a qualified chartered environmentalist, so it is entirely possible to kind of build up that way.
Yeah, Kevin, I'm not going to ask you to answer the first question because I feel like you answered two versions of how you can get young people engaged. I want to come back to sort of the mentorship point, because I do think it's really important around how you sort of like, you know, learn from past campaigns and, you know, like people who've been doing this work for, like, I wonder if through the work that you're doing, is that happening through the climate activism that you do? Are you sort of collaborating and working with, you know, more institutionalized organizations, or is it sort of just, you know, very sort of like, you know, is it just born out of sort of the passion of you and your friends and others in this space who want to see a change?
You know, starting at the age of 11, I didn't have a mentor. So for about 8 years, I didn't have a mentor. And then recently, I started learning from those that came before me and those that were still working, like Dr. Vandana Shiva, Ron Finley, who's from South Central Los Angeles, who does gardening and talks about food inequities and food injustices. And so I do the young people I speak to, a lot of them say that they don't have mentors in these spaces, but there are a lot of young people that I do tend to speak to that say they do, and that they have people who they look up to, like Jane Goodall and Dr. Vandana Shiva and all these other amazing activists and influential change makers. So I think it's that knowledge that's being passed down from generation to generation that brings upon the impact to continue doing the work that we're doing.
That's perfect timing. I think I found my teammate now for Squid Game. Yeah. Listen, I want to say let's get a massive round of applause for our panelists who joined us today. I think also we should also recognize as well for a lot of people in local government and a lot of our leaders in local government, there is a lot of pressure for them to deliver on the pressures that are facing. And I think too often sort of they get this slack for leading extremely sort of ambitious and bold policies whilst at the same time not trying to sort of be seen as telling people how to live. So I think it's important that we recognize the good work that they do as well. So thank you, Phil, and lots of other people who are leading the way on that. I think we should give a massive round of applause to them as well. Great, and that was the bell. But no, thank you all for being such a great audience with us today. And thank you to everyone watching us online. And yeah, look forward to having this conversation. Thank you.